The scent of rain-soaked earth and crushed pride clung to Selira like a second skin. It was a perfume she had worn for all her 19 years. In a world that celebrated the wolf, she was an empty vessel, a void where a wild spirit should have been. She was an Omega, but even that lowly title felt too generous. Other Omegas could at least feel the pack bond, a faint hum of belonging. Selira felt nothing but the hollow echo of her own heart. Her own family looked at her as a living symbol of shame, a flaw in their otherwise perfect lineage. Her sister, Kalira, was everything Selira was not. Kalira's wolf was a magnificent creature of silver fur and amber eyes, her presence a crackle of vitality and strength. She was the pride of the Silver Moon Pack, destined to be a Luna, her path paved with adoration. Selira's path was a muddy track leading to nowhere. Her only notable trait was a quiet affinity for things that grew. Flowers bloomed brighter under her touch, and frightened animals would sometimes approach her, sensing a gentleness that the loud, proud wolves of her pack lacked. It was a useless skill, a parlor trick in a society that valued fangs and claws over flowers and fauna. The pack hall buzzed with a nervous energy that scraped against Selira's nerves. Her father, Alpha Morcant, stood before the assembled pack, his face a mask of grim duty. News had traveled on the wind for weeks, whispers of the Alpha King's decree. King Theron, the Shadow Wolf of the North, a monarch spoken of in hushed, fearful tones, had demanded a tribute from every pack in his domain. Not gold or grain, but a person. One shifter from each territory, to be sent to his desolate fortress, the Shadow Vale Keep, for a purpose none dared to guess. He demands a tribute. Alpha Morcan's voice boomed, silencing the last of the murmurs. One of our own must go to serve the king. His eyes, cold chips of granite, scanned the crowd. They slid past warriors and hunters, past healers and elders. They slid past Kalira, his perfect daughter, and landed with crushing finality on Selira. A collective, silent understanding rippled through the hall. Of course, the wolfless one, the broken piece. Selira will go, he declared. There was no discussion, no pity in his tone. It was a simple, practical decision. One rids oneself of a burden by giving it away. Kalira shot her a look of fleeting sympathy, quickly masked. Selira felt the world tilt, the floor dropping away beneath her feet. She was not being sent, she was being discarded. Thrown to the monster in the dark to save the worthy. A cold dread, sharper than any claw, sank into her soul. She was being sent to the feared Alpha King, a man said to be more beast than shifter, a king who ruled a kingdom of rock and shadow. Her life, already a shadow, was about to be swallowed by darkness completely. The journey north was a blur of gray skies and skeletal trees. Selira traveled with two of her father's grim-faced guards, who spoke to her only when necessary. They looked at her not with contempt, but with a kind of weary pity, as if escorting a ghost to its grave. The closer they came to the Shadow Vale Keep, the colder the air grew, biting with a chill that had nothing to do with the season. The very land seemed to hold its breath, cowed by the power that emanated from the distant fortress. Shadow Vale Keep was not built so much as it was clawed from the mountain itself. It loomed against the bruised twilight sky, a jagged silhouette of black stone and sharp towers that pierced the clouds like broken teeth. There were no banners, no signs of life, only the mournful cry of the wind whistling through its crenellations. Selira's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was a place where hope came to die. The massive gates groaned open, revealing a courtyard shrouded in gloom. A man stepped forward to meet them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same unforgiving stone as the castle. Scars mapped his skin, and his eyes were a flat, hard gray. "I am Korath, Beta to the king," he said, his voice a low rumble. His gaze swept over Salira, clinical and unimpressed. "The tribute from Silvermoon." It was not a question. Her father's guards offered a curt bow, handed Korath a scroll bearing her father's seal, and turned to leave without a single backward glance. The finality of the act was a physical blow. The gates boomed shut behind them, the sound echoing the closing of a tomb. She was alone. Korath gestured for her to follow, his silence more intimidating than any threat. He led her through cavernous, cold hallways, the only sound the tap of her worn boots on the stone. The air was thick with the scent of old magic, ozone, and a faint, unsettling trace of something wild and predatory. It was the scent of the king. He brought her to a vast throne room, a chamber of shadow and echoes. At the far end, upon a throne of polished obsidian that seemed to drink the light from the air, sat the Alpha King. Theron was larger than she had imagined, a figure of raw, intimidating power. His hair was as black as a starless night, and his face was a study in harsh beauty, marred by a vicious scar that cut from his temple to his jaw. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of molten gold, burning with a fierce, ancient light, yet rimmed with a profound, chilling emptiness. He did not rise. He simply watched her approach, his gaze a physical weight that pressed down on her. Korath announced her presence and then retreated to the shadows, leaving her exposed in the center of the immense room. She stood before him, her hands trembling at her sides, forcing herself to keep her chin up. She had lost her pack, her family, her future. All she had left was the tattered remnant of her dignity. Theron finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through the stone floor. "The Silvermoon Pack sends me a pup with no scent." He leaned forward slightly, the golden eyes narrowing as they dissected her. "You are wolfless." It was a statement of fact, delivered with the casual cruelty of a predator toying with its prey. The shame she had carried her whole life burned hot in her cheeks. "I am, Your Majesty," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. A humorless smirk twisted his lips. He looked her up and down, a slow, dismissive appraisal that made her feel like less than nothing. He saw her for what she was, what everyone had always seen, a failure, a broken thing. The mockery in his gaze was a familiar sting. "My court is a place of strength, of power. What use could I possibly have for an Omega who cannot even embrace her own nature?" he mused, the question rhetorical and sharp. He stood then, unfolding from the throne with a predator's grace. He was impossibly tall, dwarfing her completely as he circled her. She could feel the raw power rolling off him in waves, an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to crane her neck to look up at him. "They send me their weakest, thinking it an insult. Perhaps it is." His eyes glinted with a dark, bitter amusement. "Tell me, little Omega, do you believe in miracles?" He did not wait for an answer. "The blood moon comes in 2 cycles. It is a night of power, of transformation." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. "Shift for me under the blood moon, little Omega, and perhaps then I'll call you my mate." The cruel laughter that followed him as he turned away and strode from the room was worse than any physical blow. It was a dismissal of her entire existence, a joke made at the expense of her deepest wound. The throne room felt colder, emptier than before. She was trapped in the heart of the shadow, mocked by its king, with an impossible challenge hanging over her head. Solyra was not given a role, a title, or even a specific set of duties. She was simply there, a ghost haunting the edges of the castle's grim life. The few servants who populated the keep, gaunt, silent shifters who seemed as worn down as the stone walls, avoided her gaze. She was the king's new curiosity, his living jest, and no one wanted to be associated with her. She was assigned a small cold chamber in a disused wing of the castle and left to her own devices. For days, she drifted through the oppressive silence, the king's mocking words echoing in her mind. Loneliness was an old companion, but here, in this place of profound isolation, it had teeth. Despair was a tempting abyss. But within Solyra, buried deep beneath the layers of shame and rejection, was a stubborn seed of resilience. She had survived her father's coldness and her pack's scorn. She would survive this. One afternoon, while exploring the labyrinthine castle, she stumbled upon a heavy, vine-choked door. Curiosity, a feeling she had not experienced in a long time, compelled her to push it open. The hinges shrieked in protest, revealing a vast glass-walled room. It was a conservatory, but it was a graveyard. The skeletal remains of exotic plants drooped from their pots, their leaves like brittle paper. Dust lay thick on everything, and the air was stale with decay. Yet, through a grime-covered pane in the ceiling, a single determined ray of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating a small patch of floor. Something stirred in Solyra's chest, a flicker of purpose. She found a broom and a bucket, and she began to work. She swept away the dust and the dead leaves. She found a spigot and coaxed a trickle of rusty water from it. She spent hours cleaning the glass, letting the weak northern light flood the space. It was backbreaking, mindless work, and it was a balm to her frayed soul. As she worked, she began to hum, old, wordless melodies her mother had sung to her before she had passed, before the pack had fully decided Solyra was a curse. She ran her fingers over the dry, cracked soil in the planters. She whispered to the dead-looking twigs and stems, coaxing them, encouraging them. It was the only power she had, this strange, quiet connection to growing things. A week passed, then two, and slowly, miraculously, life began to return. A tiny green shoot pushed its way through the soil. A dormant vine on the wall unfurled a single tender leaf. The conservatory, once a tomb, was breathing again, and in healing it, Solyra felt a small part of herself begin to heal too. From the battlements high above the courtyard, Theron watched. His kingdom was one of stone and shadow, his life a constant battle against the beast that clawed at the inside of his own skin. The curse, a legacy of his father's dark ambition, was a living thing within him. It was a monstrous wolf of pure shadow and untamable rage, separate from his own shifter spirit. It tore at him, demanding release, threatening to consume him entirely. It was the reason for his isolation, his cruelty, his scars. The last time he had lost control, he had laid waste to 3 miles of forest and nearly killed his own beta, Korath. He had demanded the tributes not out of a need for servants, but out of a desperate dying hope. His father's journals spoke of an anchor, a balancing force that could soothe the shadow beast. He had thought it would be a shifter of immense power, a warrior or a seer. Instead, the packs had sent him their outcasts, their weak, their unwanted. And the Silver Moon Pack had sent him a wolfless Omega, a broken thing. His mockery of her had been born from the depths of his own bitter disappointment. Yet, he found himself drawn to her. He had felt it the moment she walked into his throne room. A strange quiet settled over the raging storm inside him. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. The beast, which perpetually snarled and clawed for dominance, had stilled for a brief second. He had dismissed it as a fluke. Now he watched her in the conservatory. He had seen her go in there, had expected her to give up after an hour in the dead, forgotten place. But she had not. Day after day she toiled, bringing the place back to life with a gentle, stubborn determination that baffled him. He could feel the change even from here. The oppressive atmosphere of the keep seemed to pull back from that one wing of the castle, replaced by something clean and calm. He watched her coaxing a leaf from a dead branch, her face soft with concentration, and the beast inside him did not snarl. It watched, too, curious, quiet. He did not understand it, and the not understanding made him angry. Power was strength, claws, dominance. What was this quiet, gentle magic she possessed? The pain hit him without warning, a searing agony that started behind his eyes and spread like fire through his veins. The beast was fighting him, clawing at the bars of his control, enraged by a surge of dark magic that ebbed and flowed with the coming moon. He stumbled away from the battlements, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision blurring. He needed to get to the reinforced chambers in the dungeons, the only place he could safely lock himself away. He took a shortcut, his boots echoing through a deserted hallway, but the pain was too intense. He staggered, leaning against a cold stone wall, a low growl tearing from his throat. The shadows in the corners of the hall seemed to deepen, to writhe and reach for him. He was losing. The door to the conservatory opened and Selira stepped out, a small wilting flower in her hand. She froze when she saw him. Fear flashed in her eyes, wide and luminous in the gloom. He expected her to run. Everyone ran. But she did not. She saw the sweat on his brow, the tremor in his powerful frame, the feral glint in his golden eyes. She saw not a king, but a creature in agony. The air around him was thick with a violent, chaotic energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. It felt like a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle. "Your Majesty?" she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Get back," he snarled, the voice more beast than man. The shadows around him coalesced, and for a terrifying second she thought she saw another set of eyes, red and malevolent, staring out from behind his own. The raw menace in the air should have sent her fleeing, but her strange empathy, the very thing that made her an outcast, was screaming at her. It wasn't just him. There was something else with him, something full of pain and rage. Instead of backing away, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She held out the small, wilting flower. She focused not on the king, but on the violent energy suffocating him. She did not try to fight it. She simply soothed it. She let the quiet, life-affirming energy she used on her plants flow from her, not as a weapon, but as a gentle stream of peace. The effect was instantaneous and startling. The writhing shadows receded. The feral light in Theron's eyes flickered, and the agonizing pressure in his head lessened by a fraction. He stared at her, at the simple, wilting flower in her hand, his chest heaving. The beast within him, which had been on the verge of ripping free, quieted, its rage momentarily baffled by this unexpected calm. He did not understand what she had just done, but he knew it was her. The quiet he had felt before was now a tangible presence, a cool balm on his burning soul. This wolfless, broken Omega had done what no amount of iron will or brute force on his part ever could. She had silenced the beast. The realization was terrifying. It made him feel vulnerable, exposed. "Stay away from me," he commanded, his voice rough with the effort of control. He pushed himself off the wall and stalked away, his retreat more of a flight than a dismissal. He left Solyra standing alone in the hallway, the flower still in her hand, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a bewildering, newfound sense of power. Word of the king's favor, however strange and reluctant, traveled quickly through the keep's network of whispers. The servants began to look at Solyra with a new emotion, cautious curiosity. But with favor came notice, and not all of it was welcome. Lord Mortavius, the king's uncle and most trusted advisor, was a man who thrived in the shadows Theron cast. He was sharp, cunning, and possessed a fanatical belief in the purity of bloodlines and the necessity of brutal strength. Mortavius had watched the wolfless Omega from the moment she arrived. He'd approved of the king's initial mockery. An Omega with no wolf was an abomination, a stain on the sacred traditions of their people. He had assumed she would waste away in some forgotten corner of the castle. But now he saw the king watching her. He saw the change in the castle's atmosphere, centered around the ridiculously flourishing conservatory. He saw the king seek out the hallways she frequented. He saw weakness, a dangerous distraction from the king's true purpose, controlling the beast and maintaining his iron-fisted rule. He cornered Solyra one morning as she carried a pot of newly sprouted moon-petal blossoms. "The king has taken an interest in your gardening," Mortavius said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, but with an underlying sharpness. His smile did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "I simply enjoy it, my lord," Solyra replied, dipping her head respectfully. She could feel a cloying ambition from him, a stark contrast to the raw, painful power of the king. "A quaint hobby," Mortavius continued, circling her slowly, much as the king had done, but his presence was slimy where Theron's was overwhelming. "But you must remember your place. You are a tribute, a servant. The king is burdened by matters of state, by personal afflictions. He does not need distractions, especially not from one who is incomplete." He let the word hang in the air, a deliberate, poisoned dart. "Do not imagine yourself to be more than you are. The king's attention is fleeting. His displeasure, however, is permanent. See that you do not earn it." The threat was clear. Mortavius saw her not as a person, but as a pawn or an obstacle. His words rekindled the old fears, the familiar feeling of being worthless and in the way. For a moment, she faltered. But then she thought of the flicker of relief she had seen on Theron's face, the brief quieting of his storm. Something was happening between her and the king, something she did not understand. And for the first time in her life, it felt important. She clutched the flower pot tighter and gave Mortavius a small, steady nod before walking away, her back straight. She would not be so easily intimidated. The quiet life of the keep continued, but a new routine began to form, unspoken and strange. Solyra, finding her voice in the safety of her revived conservatory, started sharing stories with the few elderly servants who dared to visit her there. They were old tales her mother had told her, stories not of great battles or mighty alphas, but of the balance of the world. Tales of the sun and moon, of the forest and the stream, of how the smallest seed held the promise of the greatest tree. She spoke of the first wolves, who were not just predators, but guardians, and how their strength was balanced by the wisdom of the earth itself. Her voice was soft, but it carried a resonance of deep, simple truth. The servants would listen, their weary faces softening, finding a moment's peace in her words. She was never aware of the shadow that lingered just outside the glass doors. Theron, drawn by the same calming energy that had soothed him in the hallway, found himself listening. He stood in the gloom, hidden from view, as she told a story about a great, ancient tree whose roots were tangled with a dark, consuming shadow. The shadow fed on the tree's life force, causing it to grow twisted and monstrous, until a gentle rain washed the soil and allowed the light to reach the roots, not destroying the shadow, but integrating it, turning its darkness into fertile ground. The story struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was his story. The curse was his shadow, tangled in the roots of his soul. He had spent his entire life trying to fight it, to starve it, to cut it out. It had never occurred to him that it could be balanced. The concept was so foreign, so contrary to everything he had ever been taught, that it left him reeling. This wolfless Omega, with her simple stories, understood his struggle better than anyone. The next night, he did not hide. He waited for her in the hallway as she left the conservatory. The servants who had been with her scurried away at the sight of him, their heads bowed. Solyra stopped, her heart beginning to pound. "Your stories," he said, his voice a low command. "The ones you tell the servants?" I am sorry, Your Majesty. I did not mean to." "Do not apologize." He cut her off, his golden eyes intense. "From now on, you will tell them only to me." It was not a request. He led her not to the throne room, but to his private study, a room filled with books and maps, dominated by a large hearth where a fire crackled. It was the heart of his domain, a place no one but Korath ever entered. And so the ritual began. Every night, Solyra would sit by the fire in the king's study, and she would tell him a story. She spoke of moon spirits and river souls, of ancient pacts between shifter and land. And as she spoke, Theron would sit in his large chair, the firelight flickering across his scarred face, and the raging beast within him would fall silent. Her voice, the cadence of her words, the quiet power woven into them, was an anchor in the storm of his existence. For the first time since he was a boy, he knew moments of true peace. A week into their nightly ritual, a raid on the kingdom's southern border forced Theron to ride out with his warriors. The feral tribes of the Broken Mountains were testing his defenses. He and his men fought them back, a swift and brutal victory, but Theron pushed himself too hard. The exertion and bloodshed agitated the beast, and he felt the control he had so carefully cultivated begin to fray. In a moment of distraction, a feral's poisoned dagger sliced across his arm. It was a shallow wound, one that his shifter healing should have closed in minutes. But the poison was laced with dark magic, designed to provoke and inflame. Instead of healing, the wound began to fester, black veins spreading from it up his arm. The dark magic fed his curse, and the beast roared with a terrifying, triumphant fury. He made it back to the keep, barely conscious, Korath supporting his staggering frame. They bypassed the healers. No ordinary poultice could fight this. Korath helped him to his chambers, the pain causing Theron to lash out, a wave of raw power cracking the stone walls. Solyra heard the commotion from the study, where she had been waiting for him. A cold dread filled her. She followed the trail of chaotic energy to his chambers, her heart in her throat. The door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she saw him slumped in a chair, his face pale with sweat, his arm a sickening sight of black and angry red. Korath stood by helplessly, his face etched with worry. "You must leave, my lady," Korath said, spotting her. "The king is not himself." But Solyra's gaze was fixed on the wound. It felt like the blighted plants in the conservatory, a living thing being choked by a dark parasitic force. She knew with an unshakable certainty that she could help. She ignored Korath's warning and stepped into the room. Theron looked up, his eyes glowing with a dangerous fever. "I told you to stay away," he growled, clutching his arm. "You are hurt," she said softly, approaching him as she would a wounded wolf, slow and unthreatening. "Let me see." "It is poison, dark magic. You can do nothing." She reached his side and gently, hesitantly, placed her hand not on the wound itself, but just above it, where the black veins began their corrupting spread. She did not try to force the poison out. She did not have that kind of power. Instead, she closed her eyes and focused, pouring her own quiet, life-filled energy into him. It was like offering a cool, clear spring to a parched man. She coaxed his own natural healing, which was being suppressed by the dark magic, to reawaken. She soothed the inflammation, calmed the magical chaos. Theron gasped as her energy flowed into him. It was not a violent surge of power, but a gentle, pervasive calm that met the raging fire of the poison and did not fight it, but simply cooled it. The beast within him, which had been reveling in the chaos, fell silent, confused by this gentle intrusion. Under her hand, the angry red began to fade, and the terrifying black veins slowly started to recede. His own powerful healing, finally freed, began to knit the flesh back together. He stared at her, his mind reeling. She had not healed him with magic in the traditional sense. She had enabled him to heal himself. This small, wolfless Omega possessed a power more subtle and perhaps more profound than any he had ever encountered. He was still the feared Alpha King, but in that moment, as she tended to him with a quiet courage he could not comprehend, he felt a crack appear in the armor around his heart. She pulled her hand back, her face pale from the effort, and he was left with the undeniable truth. She had saved him. After that night, the fragile barrier between them crumbled. The nightly stories continued, but now they were interspersed with conversation. Theron, who had not spoken of his past to a living soul, found himself telling her things. He spoke of his lonely childhood in the shadow of his ambitious, cruel father. He spoke of the day the curse had first manifested, the terror and the shame. He did not name the beast, not yet, but he spoke around it, describing the storm that lived inside him. Salira, in turn, told him of her own quiet life, of the pain of being wolfless, of the constant grinding weight of her family's disappointment. For the first time, she spoke of it not with shame, but as a simple fact of her life. In the warm intimacy of the study, with the firelight dancing between them, they were not a king and a tribute. They were two isolated souls finding a flicker of understanding in each other. He began to show her small kindnesses that felt monumental. One afternoon, he found her in the conservatory, struggling to reach a high vine. Without a word, he lifted her up, his large hand securely at her waist. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, a spark of heat that had nothing to do with magic. Their eyes met, and the air crackled with a sudden, intense awareness. He set her down gently, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. A rare, genuine smile would sometimes grace his lips when she told a particularly clever story. He had a gift delivered to her chambers, a set of fine gardening tools with polished wooden handles. It was a simple gift, but it was a profound acknowledgement. He saw her. He saw her value, not as a shifter, but as Salira. A strange, powerful current was building between them. Salira recognized it from the old tales, the fated pull between mates. It was a terrifying, exhilarating hum beneath her skin whenever he was near. His scent, once so intimidating, was now a source of comfort. She found herself watching for him, her day feeling incomplete until their nightly meeting. Theron felt it too, a magnetic pull that was separate from the beast's strange quietness in her presence. It was his own spirit, his own wolf, that recognized her. This wolfless Omega, who should have been nothing to him, was becoming his everything. The thought was terrifying, a vulnerability he could not afford, but it was also a hope so fierce it threatened to break him open. The idea of a mate had been a dream he'd abandoned long ago. The beast would have killed anyone who came that close. Yet, Selira did not just survive his proximity. She thrived, and she made him feel almost whole. Lord Mortavius observed this transformation with mounting alarm. The king was changing. The sharp, cruel edge that Mortavius had so carefully honed for years was softening. The king was spending his nights listening to stories from a defective Omega instead of planning strategies to expand his dominion. He saw their bond not as a healing connection, but as a sickness, a weakness that would destroy the kingdom. Selira was not an anchor. She was a poison of a different sort, one that promised to dilute the pure, predatory strength of their lineage. He knew he had to act. He could not challenge the king directly, not yet, but he could remove the source of the infection. He needed to turn the king against her, to remind him of the harsh realities of their world and the folly of his sentiment. The plan was simple and cruel. Mortavius waited for the night of a formal dinner, a rare occasion where Theron met with the lords of the surrounding territories. He watched as a servant brought the king's customary goblet of wine. With practiced subtlety, Mortavius intercepted the servant in a shadowy alcove. He did not add a lethal poison, that would be too obvious. He added a few drops of wolfsbane, diluted but still potent. It would cause sickness, weakness, a reminder of vulnerability. And then he produced a small, empty vial, which he had previously stolen from Selira's small room, a vial she used for keeping rare seeds. At the dinner, Theron took a sip of the wine and his face tightened. He did not show weakness, but a flicker of pain crossed his features. He set the goblet down. Mortavius chose his moment perfectly. "Is something amiss, Your Majesty?" he asked, his voice filled with false concern. Theron's golden eyes narrowed. He knew the taste of wolfsbane. He also knew his own tolerance was high. It would sicken him, but not incapacitate him. His gaze swept the room, instantly calculating. "Guards!" Mortavius's voice rang out with authority. "The king's wine is poisoned!" He moved with feigned urgency, picking up the goblet. "Who brought this?" The terrified servant was dragged forward. And then, Mortavius's men, acting on his prior instructions, presented the evidence they had found. "We searched the kitchens, my lord, and the tribute's chambers. We found this." He held up the small seed vial for all to see. "It was in the Omega's room. She has been poisoning the king, seeking power for herself." The accusation hung in the shocked silence of the hall. Selira, who had been standing near the back of the room, felt the blood drain from her face. All eyes turned to her, a sea of accusation and contempt. It was happening all over again. The scorn, the rejection, the assumption of her guilt. She looked toward Theron, her heart shattering, praying to see disbelief, to see him defend her. But his face was an unreadable mask of cold fury. He looked from the vial to her, and his expression was as hard and unforgiving as the day she had arrived. "Take her to the dungeons," Theron commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth, all connection. The words were a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Guards seized her arms, their grips rough and impersonal. As they dragged her away, her desperate eyes met Theron's one last time. She saw nothing of the man who smiled at her stories, nothing of the soul who had found peace in her presence. She saw only the cold, merciless Alpha King, and in that moment, she believed Mortavius had won. He had snuffed out the tiny flame of hope and plunged her back into the darkness. The dungeons of Shadowvale Keep were as cold and unforgiving as the king's heart. The damp stone leached the warmth from her body, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by a sliver of light from a grate high above. The old feelings washed over her with the force of a tidal wave, the powerlessness, the worthlessness, the bone-deep certainty that she was flawed and unlovable. Her father had cast her out, her pack had scorned her. And now Theron, the one person who had seen a glimmer of something more in her, had believed the worst without a second's thought. The hope she had so foolishly nurtured withered and died in the cold, damp air. The mockery from their first meeting echoed in her head. "Shift for me under the blood moon, and perhaps then I'll call you my mate." It had been a joke then, and it was a tragedy now. He had never seen her. He had only seen a curiosity, a temporary balm for his own pain. The moment she became an inconvenience, he had discarded her, just as her father had. The thought was a shard of ice in her chest, more painful than any physical torment. Betrayal was a poison far more potent than wolfsbane. Theron sat on his throne, the hall now empty save for Karath, the untouched goblet of wine still on the table before him. The cold fury on his face was not a mask, it was a raging inferno. But it was not directed at Selira, it was for Mortavius, for the lords who had looked at her with such contempt, for the trap he had been forced to spring. The moment he had tasted the wolfsbane, he had known. It was his uncle's move, subtle, political, designed to isolate him and remove a perceived weakness. He knew Selira was innocent with a certainty that was absolute, a conviction that came from the deepest part of his soul. The mate bond, fragile and unspoken as it was, screamed her innocence. But to defend her outright would have been foolish. It would have shown his hand, revealed her importance to him, and made her an even bigger target. He had to play the part of the cold, betrayed king to uncover the full extent of his uncle's treachery. But playing the part was agony. Seeing the look of utter devastation and betrayal on her face as she was dragged away had felt like a blade twisting in his own gut. The beast within him, which had been soothed by her presence for weeks, was now a roaring tempest of fury. It did not rage against him. It raged for her. It wanted to tear down the walls, to rip apart the guards who had dared to lay hands on her, to reduce Mortavius to a bloody smear on the stone floor. It took every ounce of Theron's formidable will to keep it chained. The separation from her was a physical pain, a tearing at the bond that had just begun to form. He had to end this. Now. "Bring my uncle to me," Theron said to Korath, his voice dangerously quiet. Mortavius entered the throne room with a triumphant smirk barely concealed beneath a veneer of solemn concern. "A terrible business, Your Majesty, to be betrayed by one you showed such unusual kindness. But the weak are often treacherous. I have the guards preparing for her interrogation." "That will not be necessary," Theron said, rising from his throne. He picked up the goblet of wine. "You are a student of poisons, are you not, uncle? You know that while wolfsbane is an irritant to a true alpha, it is quite lethal to those with lesser blood." He swirled the wine, his golden eyes fixed on Mortavius. "And you know that I have a particular tolerance for it, developed over many years of assassination attempts, many of which I suspect you were aware of." Mortavius's smirk faltered. I don't understand." "I did not drink the wine," Theron said, his voice dropping to a lethal growl. He let the goblet fall from his hand, its contents splashing across the stone floor. It was full. I felt the touch of your magic on the cup the moment the servant brought it. A faint trace of your power, used to mask the scent of the poison from my senses. A clever trick, but not clever enough. He took a menacing step forward. You sought to frame an innocent to serve your own ambition. You sought to manipulate me. The blood drained from Mortavius's face as Theron's trap snapped shut. You have no proof. I have the word of the servant who you threatened. I have the testimony of my own beta who saw you intercept him. Korath stepped from the shadows, his hand on his sword. And I have this. Theron's hand shot out, snatching a chain from around Mortavius's neck, hidden beneath his tunic. On it was a small locket. He crushed it in his palm, and a fine powder, smelling faintly of wolfsbane, dusted his fingers. You are a fool, uncle. You underestimated my intelligence, and you underestimated her importance. Theron did not wait for the guards. He strode from the throne room, his power rolling off him in palpable waves, leaving Korath to deal with the stunned and terrified Mortavius. He descended the stairs to the dungeons 2 at a time, the beast inside him roaring with triumph and need. He threw open the door to her cell himself. The sight of her, huddled in the corner, pale and shivering, broke through the last of his control. He crossed the cell in a single stride and knelt before her. Salira, he breathed, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him. She flinched away, her eyes wide with fear and hurt. It was a lie, he said, his voice raw. I never believed it. I had to let him think he had won, to expose him. He reached out, his hand hesitating before gently touching her cheek. Forgive me. Forgive me for letting you feel that pain, even for a moment. He swept her up into his arms, holding her against his chest as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He carried her from the cold darkness of the dungeon, his long strides eating up the corridors as he took her back toward the light. He did not take her to her room. He carried her to his own chambers, the ones connected to the study, and set her down gently before the fire. He knelt before her, chafing her cold hands in his own. I am a fool, Salira. I have been ruled by this curse, by this darkness, for so long that I have forgotten how to trust in anything good. He looked at her, his golden eyes stripped of all their harshness, leaving only a raw, desperate vulnerability. I have to tell you. You have to understand what I am. He took a deep breath, the confession costing him everything. My father, in his quest for ultimate power, bound a shadow demon to our bloodline. It is not a part of my wolf. It is a separate entity, a monstrous beast of pure rage that is tethered to my soul. That is my curse. It fights me for control every second of every day. He gestured around the reinforced room. This is why I live in isolation. This is why they call me a monster. Because sometimes the monster wins. His voice cracked. The blood moon is in 3 days. It is the one night of the year when the veil between worlds is thinnest, when the demon's power is at its absolute peak. It is the night I am most likely to lose myself to it. Forever. Tears welled in his eyes, a sight so shocking Salira forgot her own pain. From the moment you arrived, the beast has been quieter. Your presence, your stories, your touch. You are the anchor the journal spoke of. You are the balance to my chaos. He took her hands, his grip tight and desperate. I believe you are my mate, Salira, the one soul in all the world meant to complete my own. But I am terrified. I am terrified that on the night of the blood moon, the beast will see you not as its anchor, but as its final obstacle, and it will destroy you. The confession lay between them, raw and terrible and beautiful. He was the wounded alpha, the feared king, and he was laying his broken soul at her feet. All her fear, all her hurt, melted away, replaced by a fierce, protective wave of emotion. She finally understood the depth of his pain, the reason for his coldness. She reached out and touched the scar on his face, her fingers tracing the path of some long-ago battle with his inner demon. "You won't lose," she whispered, her voice full of a conviction that stunned them both. "We won't let it." The night of the blood moon fell upon the keep like a shroud of crimson silk. The moon hung in the sky, swollen and red, bathing the stone walls in an eerie, sanguinary light. Inside the castle, a different kind of chaos erupted. Mortavius, having used a hidden network of loyalists to escape his confinement, launched a desperate, suicidal attack. He knew Theron would be at his most vulnerable tonight. If he could not rule the kingdom, he would see it burn. Alarms blared through the keep. The clash of steel echoed in the courtyards as Korath and the loyal guards met the traitors. Theron was in his chambers with Selira, the first waves of the transformation already racking his body. His skin was fever-hot, and shadows writhed at the edges of his form. "You have to go," he gritted out, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. "Get to the conservatory. It's the safest place." "I am not leaving you," Selira said, her voice steady despite the terror coiling in her stomach. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and he shuddered. The calming effect of her touch fighting a losing battle against the surging power of the demon. Suddenly the chamber doors burst open. It was not Korath. It was Mortavius, his face twisted in a mask of manic triumph, flanked by two of his largest men. "So, this is the king's weakness," Mortavius sneered, his eyes locking on Selira. "A wolfless pet. How fitting." He gestured to his men. "Take her. We will see how the king fights when his little anchor is screaming." As the men advanced on Selira, something inside Theron snapped. The agonizing battle for control, the fear of the beast, the carefully constructed walls of his will, they all shattered. All that remained was a single, primal imperative: protect her. He saw the men lay hands on her, saw the fear in her eyes, and a roar that was not human and not wolf tore from his throat. He threw back his head, and the transformation took him, but it was not his usual shift. He did not fight the demon. He embraced it. He pulled its raw, chaotic power into himself, letting it fuel him. Shadow exploded from him, a vortex of darkness and rage. His body twisted and grew, bones cracking and reforming not into the shape of a wolf, but into something far more terrifying. A creature of nightmare rose in his place, a wolf-like beast made of living shadow, its form indistinct and shifting. It was immense, its claws like obsidian daggers, its teeth a forest of sharpened night. Its eyes were not Theron's gold, but two burning embers of pure crimson malice. This was the demon, fully unleashed. It moved with impossible speed. Before Mortavius's men could even react, two shadowy tendrils lashed out, and they were thrown against the far wall with bone-shattering force. The shadow beast turned its glowing red eyes on Mortavius, who stumbled back, his triumphant sneer replaced by abject terror. This was not the struggle he had expected. This was a god of destruction. But the beast, having eliminated the immediate threat, was lost to its rage. It was a force of pure, untempered destruction. Its head whipped around, its malevolent gaze falling upon the room, upon the guards fighting in the hall, upon everything. And then its red eyes settled on Selira, the anchor, the cage, the last thing standing in the way of its ultimate freedom. The shadow beast stalked toward her, a low growl rumbling in its chest, a sound that promised annihilation. The last vestiges of Theron were buried deep inside, screaming, helpless. The servants, the guards, Korath fighting in the doorway. They all froze, certain they were about to witness her demise. But Selira did not run. She looked at the monster before her, the creature of nightmare born from her king's pain, and she did not see a demon to be feared. She saw Theron, trapped in the heart of the storm. The king's mocking words from their first meeting rang in her ears. Shift for me under the blood moon. She had no wolf. She could not shift. But she could do something else. She stood her ground as the beast loomed over her, its hot, foul breath washing over her face. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in focus. She reached deep inside herself, past the fear, past the doubt, to the quiet, gentle core of her power. She had spent her life being told it was useless. Now she would wager her life, and his, that it was everything. She did not try to fight the darkness. She did not try to banish it. She accepted it. And then she unleashed her own power, not as a weapon, but as an offering. A wave of pure, unadulterated life energy flowed from her, a silent explosion of light and warmth. The air filled with the scent of spring rain, of blooming flowers and rich earth. The stone floor at her feet sprouted tiny, glowing mosses. It was not a shift of form, but a shift of being. She had shifted into her true self, a conduit for the life force of the world. The wave of energy washed over the shadow beast. It did not burn or harm. It felt like the first ray of sun after a long winter. It was the cool water of a stream washing over a fevered brow. The demon recoiled, not in pain, but in sheer, utter confusion. Rage could not comprehend peace. Hate could not process love. Inside the prison of the beast's mind, Theron felt her. A single brilliant point of light in the unending roaring darkness. Her essence, her love, her unshakable belief in him reached across the abyss. She was not fighting his demon. She was calling to him. Selira took a step forward and reached out, her small, pale hand touching the monster's shadowy snout. There was no fear in her touch, only acceptance. Love. Theron, she whispered, come back to me. Her touch, her voice, her power, it was the key. The light exploded within the beast. The curse, the ancient bond to the shadow demon, could not withstand such pure, unconditional acceptance. It had been forged in a ritual of ambition and hate. It was unmade by an act of selfless love. The darkness did not shatter. It dissolved. It flowed not away from Theron, but into him, the chaotic rage being tamed, integrated, transformed from a parasite into a part of his own power. The monstrous form shimmered. The malevolent red of its eyes softened, melting back into Theron's familiar molten gold. The formless shadow solidified, coalescing into the magnificent shape of a massive black wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, with faint, shifting patterns of shadow moving through its fur like smoke. It was no longer a demon. It was a true king of night and day, a wolf of shadow and light, perfectly balanced. The curse was broken. He lowered his great head and nudged her hand gently before shifting back. Theron stood before her, whole and healed. The scar on his face faded to a faint silver line. The oppressive aura of chaotic magic was gone, replaced by a calm, immense power that was entirely his own. He looked at her, his eyes full of awe and a love so profound it stole her breath. Before the stunned court, before Korath, and before the defeated Mortavius, Theron knelt before her. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and resonant, ringing with the authority of a true king. "You shifted," he said, his gaze locked with hers, "not into a wolf, but into my salvation, my anchor, my light." He rose to his feet, pulling her up with him. "You fulfilled the challenge, and I will fulfill my promise." He turned to the assembled crowd, his voice booming through the hall. "I call you my mate, my queen." In the weeks that followed, Shadowvale Keep transformed. With the curse broken and Mortavius's treachery exposed, the oppressive fear that had choked the castle for decades finally lifted. Theron, no longer fighting a constant war within himself, was a different king. His power was still immense, but it was now tempered with a quiet confidence and a compassion that no one had ever seen in him. The formal mating ceremony was held under the light of the next full moon. It was not a grand political affair, but an intimate one, held in the heart of the now thriving conservatory. Standing amidst the life she had nurtured, surrounded by blooming moon petals that glowed with a soft, silvery light, Solyra was bound to Theron. He bit her neck gently, the mark of the mate bond sealing their souls together. It did not burn. It felt like coming home. The bond settled into place, a warm, humming connection that sang with love and rightness. Her status as the wolfless Omega was forgotten, replaced by a new title whispered with awe, the Sun Heart Queen. Her gentle power, once scorned as useless, was now revered. It was the power that had saved their king, had broken a generation-spanning curse, and had brought light back to the shadows. Theron decreed that strength was not just measured in fang and claw, but in resilience, in empathy, in the courage to nurture life in the face of darkness. The seeds of change were planted not just in the conservatory, but in the very heart of the kingdom's culture. Shifters with gentler gifts, once ostracized, began to find their own places of honor in the new court. Solyra found her place not just as a queen, but as Theron's partner in every sense. She advised him, her quiet wisdom providing a balance to his decisive strength. Together, they began to heal the kingdom, mending the rifts Mortavius's ambition had created, and forging new alliances based on mutual respect rather than fear. The fortress that had once been her prison became her home, its stone walls echoing not with silence and dread, but with laughter and hope. 1 year later, the sun streamed through the immaculate glass of the conservatory, illuminating a scene of profound peace. The room was a riot of color and life, a testament to the queen who tended it. Solyra sat on a stone bench, her head resting on Theron's shoulder, her hand resting protectively on her gently rounded stomach. Theron's arm was wrapped securely around her, his fingers intertwined with hers. His kingdom was prosperous. The fear that had defined his reign was gone, replaced by a fierce loyalty born of respect and admiration. He was a just and powerful king, but at his core, he was simply a man deeply in love with his mate. The Shadow Wolf, now a part of him, rested peacefully, its power a well of strength he could draw upon, no longer a monster to be feared. "He's kicking," Solyra murmured, a soft smile on her face as she guided Theron's hand to feel the faint flutter of life within her. The court healers had been stunned. A wolfless Omega, they had whispered, was surely barren. But their union, born of a broken curse and a fated love, was one of miracles. Theron pressed a kiss to her temple, his heart swelling with a happiness he had never thought possible. He looked at his mate, his queen, the wolfless girl who had faced down his demon with nothing but courage and a belief in the good within him. She had not only saved his life, she had given him one worth living. "He has his mother's spirit," Theron said, his voice thick with emotion, stubborn. and stronger than anyone knows. Salira laughed, a light, happy sound that was now the most common music in the keep. The rejected Omega, the broken tribute, was now the cherished queen of the Alpha King, the anchor of his soul and the heart of his kingdom. Together they watched the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across their flourishing home, their future as bright and full of promise as the life growing between them. The darkness had not been vanquished. It had been taught how to love the light,